Good afternoon, and welcome to Governor Ducey's fiscal year 2018 budget recommendation presentation. My name is Lorenzo Romero. I'm the Director for the Governor's Office of Strategic Planning and Budgeting, also known as OSPB. Today we have the analyst of OSPB who will be providing presentation materials on the Governor's recommendation. After the presentation, staff will be around to answer questions that you may have. We will not be answering questions during the presentation. We'll wait to the end. Staff will be available to answer them at that point in time. We'll have the budget recommendation available online at azgovernor.gov/budget. You can also email questions and we'll respond to them at azbudget@az.gov. With that said, let's get started with the presentation.
I'm Fletcher Monzingo, and I'm a Senior Budget and Operations Analyst here at OSPB. Before discussing the budget recommendation for the coming year, I think we should start where we ended last fiscal year. Fiscal 16 ended with an ending cash balance of $284 million and a structural imbalance of $36 million. Behind these numbers, some critical financial and economic milestones were achieved. For instance, in fiscal 16, we paid off an additional $232 million of debt, which benefited our universities, the Department of Economic Security, and the Department of Child Safety, while still maintaining our rainy day reserve, which currently stands at over $460 million. Additionally, as of this past March, the state was able to regain the 300,000 jobs that were lost during the Great Recession. Since doing so, the state has experienced continued job growth. Finally, we closed out fiscal 16 with the fourth highest GDP growth in the nation. So again, we ended with $284 million in 16, which will tie into our beginning balance heading into 17. So as we take stock of our available resources, it only makes sense to begin our discussion today about our revenue forecast for 17 and beyond. The executive is forecasting 2% growth in 17, 2.6% in 18, 3.8% in 19, and 4.4% in 20. So what does this revenue forecast tell you? Well, the good news is we're growing. Based on recent trends in the job sector, personal income, and state GDP, everything is pointing to more growth for Arizona. In fact, Arizona's economy is growing faster than the nation on average. Based on these trends, we see this persisting into the future in combination with the efforts at the state and federal levels to create a pro-growth environment, which we expect to yield stronger revenue growth. So with our revenue forecast in place, we now have established our capacity for our spending priorities. Looking at 17, we have total revenues of about $9.8 billion, which includes ongoing revenues, the carry-forward balance from fiscal year 16 and previously enacted fund transfers. Enacted base spending is $9.6 billion. The executive is recommending a $36 million supplemental to close out fiscal 17, which we'll discuss in a moment. With those supplementals, that will take us to $9.64 billion in total general fund spending in 17, leaving a cash balance of $119 million and a structural balance of about $5 million. Going into fiscal 18, we have total revenues of $9.8 billion. The executive is forecasting baseline spending growth to be essentially flat at just over $1 million. It's worth noting that the reason it's flat is due to the significant one-time spending in fiscal 17, which is removed from the budget but replaced by ongoing spending for agencies such as education access and the Department of Economic Security. In addition to the baseline spending growth, the executive is recommending about $176 million in new initiative spending. Adding the baseline to the initiatives brings total fiscal 18 spending to $177 million, leaving a cash balance of $17 million at the end of fiscal 18 and a structural balance of about $11 million. It's important to note that of the $176 million, about 53% or $93 million is one time. Let's begin our discussion of new spending by looking at the $36 million supplemental recommendation in fiscal year 17. The supplemental recommendation for fiscal 17 is comprised of 4 separate issues. The first issue is the impact of Proposition 206. On November 8th, 2016, Arizona passed Proposition 206, which increases the state's minimum wage from $8.05 to $12 over 4 years. The initial step increased the minimum wage to $10 on January 1st, 2017. Then on January 1st, 2018, the minimum wage further increases to $10.50. As the proposition was written, state employees are exempt from these minimum wage increases. However, Prop 206 impacts the state's ability to maintain access to care. In other words, the state has an obligation to have a healthy network of providers that can deliver services to folks in the long-term care systems at Access and DES. And these providers are impacted by the new minimum wage law. If the state does not adjust for this new law by increasing reimbursement rates to providers, the state is at risk of damaging the health of the provider network. Because of this, the executive recommends a supplemental of $7.7 million in fiscal 17 to DES. This issue has an ongoing impact, and in 18, the executive is recommending $15.6 million at DES and $5.6 million at Access. The next issue recommended in fiscal 17 is for the Department of Child Safety. The executive recommends a one-time supplemental of $8 million from the general fund to fund child care and other support services for children in state care. We're currently projecting a shortfall of $20.6 million for these services at the department. However, the department will be able to draw down matching funds from the $8 million supplemental recommendation to cover these services in the current fiscal year. Because we've seen declines in out-of-home care, we expect that this request will only be needed on a one-time basis. The third issue recommended is for the State Land Department. The department is responsible for user fees to maintain the rights to Central Arizona Project water that can be attached to parcels of land when sold. The rate for fiscal 17 was provisionally set in June 2015, but the final rate was not set until after the last budget cycle ended in June 2016. The executive recommends a supplemental appropriation of $224,000, which represents the charges above the projected rate. The last issue recommended deals with the 1% property tax cap. A law was enacted during the 2015 session that would have saved the state $19.8 million, but was found unconstitutional in July 2016. The law would have capped the state's obligation to cover property taxes in excess of 1% of full cash value of primary residences up to $1 million per county. Anything above the $1 million per county would have been paid by taxing districts within the county as determined by the Property Tax Oversight Commission. Because this law was found unconstitutional, as the Property Tax Oversight Commission did not have the legal authority to determine who within the district would pay these taxes, the state is then obligated to pay $19.8 million in fiscal year 17 and moving forward. So in summary, the executive recommends $35.8 million as a supplemental to close out fiscal 17. Now let's discuss the fiscal 18 spending priorities for the executive. To begin, we'll start with education.
Thanks, Fletcher. I'm Charlie Martin, a Senior Budget and Operations Analyst at OSPB. This budget makes a major investment in education. We're recommending $76 million in new baseline spending for fiscal year 2018 and another $165 million in new initiative spending above the baseline level. The new initiative spending will provide an additional $453 million to education over the next 3 years. These investments are being made from kindergarten through higher education and build upon the investments that were made in fiscal year 2017 when K-12 students benefited from the first full year of increased support provided by the passage of Proposition 123, an additional $311 million in fiscal year 2017. In fiscal year 2018, schools will receive $318 million more than they otherwise would have due to the passage of Proposition 123. The executive recommendation increases support system-wide and makes targeted investments that will move Arizona closer to important education goals. Let's get into the details of the plan. To get started, the governor believes that teachers have the greatest impact on education, and to get the greatest return on investment, that we should invest in Arizona teachers. Arizona teachers got a raise for the first time in several years, due in large part to Proposition 123. However, the state continues to face a shortage of teachers. To enhance teacher recruitment and retention statewide, the executive is proposing a pay increase for all Arizona public school teachers. The 2% increase will be phased in over 5 years and will be in addition to any other salary growth that schools fund from other sources, such as annual inflation adjustments. The executive recommends $13.6 million in fiscal year 2018, and when fully implemented, this represents a new ongoing investment of $68 million per year, system-wide. The executive also recognizes that the need for talented teachers is greatest in our most high-need schools. Annual teacher turnover is about 16% nationally, and schools that serve a high percentage of low-income students experience higher than average teacher turnover and have a harder time attracting highly qualified teachers. The executive recommendation includes $6.4 million in fiscal year 2018 and a total of $19 million over the next 3 years to support teacher recruitment in high-need districts and charters. The recommendation will fund a $1,000 sign-on bonus for every new teacher that is hired by a district or charter in which more than 60% of students qualify for free or reduced price lunch. Additionally, the Math, Science, and Special Education Teacher Loan Forgiveness Program offers forgivable loans to students that are pursuing a teaching degree and agree upon graduation to teach math, science, or special education in an Arizona public school. The executive recommends $250,000 to expand this program, which more than doubles the current level of funding and will support an additional 35 students per year. The executive also makes a targeted investment to make sure that high-need districts have the resources that they need to promote early literacy. Research shows that a student's ability to read proficiently by 3rd grade is a strong predictor of high school graduation and career success. The percentage of students that pass the English language arts portion of the AZ merit test is lower in districts and charters in which a higher percentage of students are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. The executive recommends targeting additional support to districts and charters in which more than 90% of students are eligible for free or reduced price lunch through kindergarten and early literacy funding. Schools will be empowered to determine how to best use the additional resources to serve their students. In addition to all-day kindergarten, strategies could include general preschool programs, longer K-3 school days or school years, reading interventions, or adding reading coaches. The executive recommendation includes $10 million in fiscal year 2018, or $1,244 per qualifying kindergarten student, and the amount grows to $20 million per year, or $2,488 per student in fiscal year 2019 and beyond. Another way that the executive will help more students succeed is by supporting high-performing schools. The executive believes in funding results and also recognizes that overcoming obstacles to achieving results will be different for schools that are high poverty compared to schools that are low poverty. To that end, the executive recommendation provides additional resources to both groups. As you can see on the chart here, we've categorized high poverty schools as those serving a population in which more than 60% of students are eligible for free or reduced price lunch, and low poverty schools as those in which less than 60% are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. Based on this, the recommendation includes $400 per student for high poverty schools that achieve an AZ merit test pass rate in the top 10% of all high poverty schools, and $225 per student for low poverty schools that achieve pass rates in the top 10% of all schools. This totals a $38 million investment to reward the schools that are getting results. This marks the first time that the state has invested in results-driven funding, and by doing this, we expect to see high-achieving schools expand, especially in high-poverty areas. It's also important that state dollars follow students to ensure that as much funding as possible goes to schools of choice. However, unforeseen declines in enrollment can create unique mid-year challenges for school districts. The executive recommends a $20 million one-time non-lapsing appropriation to help school districts reconcile actual enrollment and funding with the previously made year-long commitments to teachers. Any school that sees actual enrollment decline more than 2% compared to the previous year will be able to apply for enrollment reconciliation funding. The amount of the funding will be equal to the revenue that would otherwise be lost by a decline in enrollment in excess of 2%. This will allow districts to avoid major operational disruptions while managing lower enrollment, but only for those that are materially impacted by an enrollment decline. The executive recommendation also provides resources for essential education infrastructure. The School Facilities Board provides financial and technical assistance to school districts using a grant-based program to maintain school facilities. Demand for the program and the volume of applications is increasing. Therefore, the executive recommends $17 million in fiscal year 2018 for building renewal to fund schools' capital needs. Another important aspect of infrastructure is technology. As schools increase digital learning, internet infrastructure needs are growing significantly. Unfortunately, many rural schools do not have a scalable internet connection and have limited capacity to support digital learning in the future. As digital learning opportunities multiply, improving broadband access for rural schools will be an increasingly important step to closing the achievement gap. The executive recommends $5 million to improve broadband access for Arizona's rural school districts and charters that currently have limited capacity. This state investment will be combined with federal E-rate dollars to allow schools to substantially improve their broadband connections at little or no cost to the school. The recommendation includes several additional investments to advance the governor's education goals. Two of those goals are increasing the rate of youth employment or enrollment in school and increasing the percentage of individuals that pursue post-secondary education. Under current law, Joint Technical Education Districts, or JTEDs, are not eligible to receive state funding for students that have already graduated high school in fiscal year 2018. The executive recommends $1 million to establish JTED completion grants, which will fund students that have already graduated high school but have finished more than half of a JTED program to allow them to complete the program and make progress toward entering the workforce. The budget also allocates $100,000 to be distributed to organizations that help students who are high-risk youth transition successfully to post-secondary education or employment. Jobs for Arizona's graduates help students stay in school and acquire skills that will help them succeed after graduation. Additionally, many of Arizona's K-12 students live at or below the poverty level, and these students have a critical need for financial aid in order to make post-secondary education a reality. Nationally, the federal government provides 80% of all student aid, and the process of qualifying for federal student aid begins with completion of the free application for federal student aid, or FAFSA. In Arizona, only 24% of high school seniors completed the FAFSA in 2015. The executive recommends $114,700 to fund the Commission for Post-Secondary Education's FAFSA completion initiative. This will help close the achievement gap for low-income students and increase the percentage of Arizonans that go to college. The program will allow school counselors to determine whether or not students' FAFSA applications have been accepted and to identify students that might need additional support in order to complete the FAFSA. In March 2015, the governor called on the State Board of Education to perform a full review of Arizona's English language arts and mathematics standards. In December of 2016, the board adopted the new academic standards for these subjects, for which the department is currently implementing. The department is also tasked with the continuous review and improvement of these standards. The executive recommendation for fiscal year 2018 includes $1.1 million to support 10.5 full-time equivalent positions that support Arizona standards and will provide technical support and professional development to advance those standards. The executive also recommends $250,000 to improve school leadership through principal mentorship and training. This funding will put principals through the Beat the Odds School Leadership Academy, which is a training program designed in partnership between the Center for the Future of Arizona and the National Institute for School Leadership. The goal of this training is to provide principals with the tools to run their schools as effectively as possible by learning best practices from industry experts. The recommended funding will support 25 seats per year. The recommendation also includes $200,000 to advance computer science in our schools and help students learn coding through the development of new academic standards and professional development opportunities for teachers. Finally, the executive recommends $800,000 to increase the number of home visits per month for children and families in the Arizona School for the Deaf and Blind's Birth to 3 program. The program helps parents develop goals and strategies so that they can learn to communicate with their children and prepare them for school. In total, the executive recommendation adds $114 million to K-12 education in fiscal year 2018, and a total of $327 million over the next 3 years. Next, we'll discuss some new investments in higher education.
Thank you, Charlie. Good afternoon. My name is Katie Simmons. I'm a budget analyst here with OSPB. Consistent with the large investment that the executive is making in our K-12 system, the executive is also making a major contribution to our universities by enabling them to leverage approximately $1 billion for capital investments in research and development infrastructure and deferred maintenance. These investments will attract and retain highly skilled teachers, help our universities continue to compete with other top research universities, foster public-private partnerships that will help launch research into commercialization, and address Arizona workforce needs. This will be financed by allowing universities to recapture all of the transaction privilege tax, also known as TPT, that they pay in fiscal year 18, which is approximately $37 million. The $37 million includes an estimated $30 million state component and a $7 million state shared component. The executive recommends that the $30 million state component be used, along with matching dollars by the universities, to issue approximately $1 billion in bonding for university capital investments. With respect to the growth of the TPT dollars used to support these capital investments, the executive recommends growth up to 2% annually be used specifically for additional capital investments. Any additional growth beyond 2% will be allocated to the universities for general operating expenses, and that does include resident student costs. The $7 million component and any growth associated with those dollars will be used for university operating expenses. Recognizing that operating resources are a key component to the university budget, the executive further recommends $15 million in one-time general fund. This funding will allow universities to address their high priority needs and support costs associated with in-state students. Next, we will discuss funding issues for Arizona's vulnerable populations.
Thank you, Katie. Good afternoon. My name is Caitlin Harrier, and I am a senior budget analyst here at OSPB. In addition to the investments being made in education, the executive also recognizes the importance of early childhood development for children as they prepare to start school. At the Department of Economic Security, the Early Intervention Program provides evaluations to children from 0 to 3 years old when there are concerns of developmental delay. This fiscal year, the department estimates they will perform 16,856 evaluations, which represents a 6.5% increase over last year. To keep up with cost increases as well as evaluation requests, the executive recommends a $2 million appropriation. Additionally, the executive recommends a one-year continuation of the $700,000 appropriated last year to help senior citizens remain in their homes longer as they age, by providing them resources to help assist with everyday activities such as bathing, dressing, and meal preparation. They can stay in their homes longer than would otherwise be possible. So the goal here is to provide them those resources so that they can age where they're most comfortable. In addition to ensuring seniors have their basic daily needs met, the executive continues to seek additional support to help seniors who are vulnerable to abuse, fraud, and neglect. Last year, the executive recommended $3 million ongoing towards adult protective services at DES. Ultimately, a $2 million one-time appropriation was made. This year, the executive recommends that $2 million be made ongoing and adding an additional $1 million, taking the total to $3 million as originally recommended for fiscal year 17. The ongoing commitment here is consistent to the need for services that we continue to see at the department. Just this last year, calls to the DES hotline where callers report suspected elderly abuse increased by about 18% over the prior year, with about 21,655 total calls coming in. So this recommendation will make the 28 staff added last year permanent and will provide an additional 15 staff, including caseworkers, hotline staff, financial exploitation unit investigators, and a registered nurse to address the medically complex cases. The executive is also recommending resources for the Department of Public Safety to clear out the sexual assault kit backlog. In January of 2016, Governor Ducey, by executive order, established the Arizona Sexual Assault Evidence Collection Kit Task Force. The goal of the task force was to determine the number of untested sexual assault kits that exist in our state and provide recommendations on how to prevent future backlogs. As a result of this work, we learned that there are still 6,424 of these kits waiting to be tested. To date, we have secured $6.1 million in federal grants to test about 4,400 of these kits. Last year, $500,000 was appropriated to cover the cost of testing an additional 600 kits. This leaves a remaining need of 1,400 kits to test. To completely eliminate the backlog of untested sexual assault kits in Arizona, the executive recommends a one-time appropriation of $1.2 million be made to DPS. The executive believes in rewarding those who are making an honest effort to get off of welfare and are actively trying to stop the cycle of poverty. To support these efforts, in FY 2018, the executive recommends an appropriation of $2.8 million be made to DES. This will provide an additional 12 months of TANF cash assistance for those individuals who are actively seeking employment or job training and are ensuring that their children maintain a 90% or higher attendance rate in school. Next, we'll discuss the recommendation for the Department of Child Safety.
Thank you. My name is Laura Johnson. I'm a manager at OSPB. Last year, the legislature made a significant funding commitment to the Department of Child Safety. The budget agreement included benchmarks and accountability measures, and less than a year later, we are seeing the positive impact of those investments. For the first time in over 10 years, the population of children in out-of-home care is beginning to drop. The backlog of inactive cases is on track to be eliminated by the end of this fiscal year, and more families are receiving services, including critical in-home services that can prevent removals. As previously mentioned, the executive is recommending a current year supplemental that will allow the agency to fully meet demand for support services. Given the continued expected decline in the out-of-home population, we do expect that to be a one-time appropriation. For FY18, the executive is recommending an ongoing appropriation of $4.2 million to continue support for the growing number of adoptive families, one of the most important elements in securing permanent placements for children, as well as reducing the out-of-home population. We're projecting an ongoing growth rate of about 9.6% year over year in adoption subsidies, and currently we have over 24,000 families in Arizona receiving adoption subsidies. Prior to achieving permanency, kinship placements can maintain and promote lifelong family connections while lessening the disruption of removal. Kinship caregivers, which include grandparents, aunts, uncles, and other relatives, are the preferred placement for children in the foster care system. The executive is recommending an additional $1 million to support the grandmother stipend to provide financial assistance for kinship placements. The executive, my apologies. Additionally, court-appointed special advocates, otherwise known as CASAs, are volunteers appointed by juvenile court judges to represent the needs and interests of abused and neglected children who have been removed from their home. Additional resources to the CASA program will expand training and educational opportunities for CASA volunteers, ensuring Arizona's foster children have access to highly informed and knowledgeable volunteers. Up next, we'll discuss important public health investments at Access.
Thank you. My name is Brett Cloninger with OSPB, of course. And the first issue that we're going to discuss today is the opioid epidemic. Prescription drug abuse has increased dramatically in recent years, both in Arizona and nationwide. Over the last decade, the number of prescription drug overdose deaths has increased by 44% in the state. In Arizona, between 2010 and 2015, there was a 155% increase in prescription drug-related hospital admissions. To address this issue and access, one of the major payers for health care in the state, the executive recommends $220,900 to hire 5 FTE positions to monitor and analyze data with respect to prescriptions made and filled within the access system. The goal for the department is to use this data to reduce opioid abuse by intervening with addicted members and investigating pharmacies and healthcare providers who may be sources of illicit opioids. Last year, we enacted a law that provided preventive and emergency dental services for the 59,000 members in the Arizona Long-Term Care, or ALTEX program. Children have received preventive and emergency dental services for many years. However, the 850,000 adults in the Access Acute program only receive dental services when the problem becomes severe enough to require a physician or oral surgeon. The executive recommendation provides emergency-only dental benefits to all adult members in the Access Acute Care program. This will improve member health outcomes and decrease the incidence of avoidable medical conditions for Access members. Next up is Chris Olvey.
Thank you, Brett. My name is Chris Olvey, Senior Analyst at OSPB. The Health Insurance Trust Fund, or HITF, is a self-insurance fund that pays the medical and dental expenses of state employees. Revenues from the fund come from premiums charged to state employees and agencies. On average, for all plans, employees pay 12% of the total premium, while agencies pay 88%. Currently, claims growth is greater than the revenue that the fund collects, which creates a concern for the health of the fund. In fiscal year 2016, the fund received $838 million in revenues and had claims of $863 million, creating a structural imbalance. However, the fund was able to pay these claims because it had sufficient reserves of $315 million. Over the last 12 months, we have seen expenses for claims grow by over 7%, nearly double the level originally forecasted. If this level of claims growth persists or increases, the health of the fund is in jeopardy, and the reserves would be eliminated, leaving no cash available to cover claims. Therefore, the executive recommends a one-time infusion of $30 million general fund to be matched by other funds to stabilize HITF in the near term and provide more time to determine if the increase in claims is a one-time occurrence or an ongoing issue. The Department of Revenue's IT infrastructure is aging and housed at a number of locations, both department and state-owned, that don't meet current data center standards. DOR has equipment dating back more than a decade, and finding professionals who know how to work with and maintain that equipment is becoming difficult. Additionally, having aged equipment spread throughout 3 different locations makes managing and troubleshooting these assets even more complex. Lastly, with respect to data center standards, these locations lack reliable power backup, physical security, and fire prevention. Together, these issues create critical risks of system failure. Last year, there were several temporary outages at the facilities, and we expect this problem to persist if not corrected. Each outage presents risk of service interruption for taxpayers. To address these and other challenges at DOR, we propose a new co-located data center in partnership with existing private sector solutions. Thus, this funding package provides the resources DOR would need to support its existing facilities while transitioning to a new off-site space with up-to-date equipment and industry-standard cooling, power, and fire safety. Next, we'll discuss our tax reform plan.
Thank you, Chris. My name is Glenn Farley, and I am the Chief Economist in the Governor's Budget Office. In fiscal year 2016, the executive championed efforts to eliminate a hidden tax increase by indexing the income tax brackets for inflation, complementing the already indexed standard deduction. To continue this policy, in fiscal year 2018, the executive is recommending that we also index the state's personal exemption. The benefits of fully indexing the state income tax code against the effects of inflation are twofold. First, we eliminate a hidden tax increase caused by the slow erosion of purchasing power through the effects of inflation. Second, we put more take-home dollars in the pockets of all Arizona income tax payers. As such, the executive is recommending preserving the value of this existing taxpayer benefit by indexing the personal exemption to the CPI beginning in the next fiscal year. Next, we'll be discussing executive recommendations to reduce recidivism rates in Arizona.
Thank you, Glenn. My name is Ryan Vergara, and I am a budget analyst at OSPB. Driving down recidivism rates is one of the executive's top priorities. This budget advances that goal with the belief that lower recidivism means more Arizonans are able to contribute positively to our state. One of the driving factors for incarceration is substance abuse. To that end, the executive recommends funding an additional 6 substance abuse counselors to increase the Maricopa Reentry Center's intensive drug treatment capacity. This will increase capacity at the MRC from treating approximately 20 people per day to 80 and is expected to reduce the number of technical violators that could be returned to prison. The executive also recommends an additional reentry planner who will work with inmates prior to release to connect them with social services and benefits. For example, inmates who were receiving substance abuse treatment in prison will work with the reentry planner to coordinate continued services upon their release. The executive's focus on decreasing recidivism is not limited to the efforts being made at the Department of Corrections. The state has 12 inmate fire crews who work to suppress and prevent wildfires across the state. The Forester provides this training to inmates so that they can work towards gaining the skills and certification necessary to become firefighters upon their release. To build on this program, the executive recommends adding a post-release fire crew, where those who participated in the department's inmate fire crews while in custody could work following their release. Crew members will further develop their skills and complete necessary training, allowing them to move on to permanent firefighting positions. The executive believes that employment is central to reducing the likelihood of recidivism. Therefore, the budget recommendation includes $1.5 million for a 20-member post-release fire crew. Next, we'll continue discussing recommendations for the Department of Forestry and discuss other investments being recommended to benefit our state's natural resources.
Thank you, Ryan. As new communication technologies become available and improve, the state can leverage these improvements to better protect its first responders and improve public safety overall. To that end, the executive recommends $269,000. This amount includes funding to update the dispatch system to meet national standards and avoid glitches during fire communications. It also provides satellite-supported GPS trackers for firefighters to improve safety when they're fighting wildfires in the most remote parts of our state. Lastly, it supports an additional deputy fire marshal to inspect public buildings and enforce fire code. Ensuring that Arizona has a sustainable water supply well into the future is a major priority for the executive, and the drought contingency plan is a key part of this effort. This plan entails purchasing water primarily from tribal entities to avoid using part of the state's Colorado River allotment. The strategy in doing so is that we would leave that water in Lake Mead so that the elevation of Lake Mead doesn't drop below 1,075 feet. This number is significant because based on an interstate agreement, once the lake drops below that point, Arizona loses a portion of its allocation. So, by reducing the amount of water that we take out of the lake today, we can avoid cuts to our supply in the future. To purchase this water, the recommendation includes $2 million per year for 3 years to cover the cost of the state's share, while the federal government is likely to pay for the majority of the total cost, which is expected to exceed $60 million. In addition to the drought contingency plan, the executive is also recommending $900,000 for DWR to hire 12 additional personnel. 7 of these positions will provide the expertise necessary to support the state's interest in complex, multi-year water rights cases. This support is important because the caseload is accelerating, and if the state fails to promptly provide information to the courts, the federal government could revoke the state's authority to do so, which could be contrary to the state's interest in these cases. The other 5 positions will provide technical expertise to help build upon the work of the Groundwater Management Code and use scientific data and analytics to proactively plan for Arizona's water supply into the future. Lastly, state parks. State parks are a critical component to the rural Arizona economy. In fact, nearly all 34 of our state parks are located in rural communities. These communities benefit greatly from visitors who come from all over the world to enjoy the parks. In fact, just recently, Northern Arizona University estimated the economic impact of state parks to be $226 million, or a 6-fold return on every dollar invested by the agency. And by way of background, the agency does not receive any general fund, and it is supported by revenues generated from park user fees. So, given that state parks are a critical economic development driver for rural Arizona, the executive recommends that state parks be enabled to be more flexible and to reinvest these dollars into those rural communities. To accomplish this, it is recommended that the revenue fund be made continuously appropriated. Providing this flexibility to state parks will allow them to make opportunistic investments that should drive more tourism and economic activity into rural Arizona, yielding over a $100 million economic impact for the state. We will now provide a summary highlighting the investments the executive budget includes.
Wrapping up the new general fund investments for fiscal 18, you can see here a quick snapshot of what these investments look like. Keep in mind that $36.8 million of the $51.8 million for higher education investments affects the revenue side of the ledger and not the spending side of the ledger. The remaining items make up the majority of our $176 million in initiative investments. So between the $176 million in new initiative investments and the university component that comes from revenues, we expect to end fiscal 18 with a cash balance of $17 million and a structural balance of $11 million. The key takeaway here is that general fund capacity is tight going into next year. However, the executive has made it clear that investing in education is a key priority. We have created a budget that achieves that priority while still maintaining a structural balance. It's important as we wrap up to do a quick review of what those investments in education are. Here's a quick review of the $165 million in additional resources that will go to education in fiscal 18. Again, this is on top of the $76 million required to fund baseline adjustments for K-12 schools. All the figures on the slide represent fiscal 18 funding amounts, and it is important to remember that the executive proposes to phase in additional support for the teacher salary increase in kindergarten and early literacy funding. The proposed teacher salary increase will represent $68 million per year of new spending at full phase-in, and their kindergarten and early literacy funding will grow to account for $20 million per year. Education funding makes up the vast majority of initiative spending in the recommended budget, and the executive is committed to investing as much as possible into education while continuing to responsibly manage the state's recovering financial position. With that, I will turn the presentation back to OSPB Director Lorenzo Romero to provide closing comments.
Thank you. Well, first off, I just want to thank the staff. They did a heck of a job. They've been working tirelessly over the last 6 months to put together a plan that prioritizes the governor's initiatives, education being its top initiative, and of course, achieving a structurally balanced budget in 17 and through this budget window. It's really important for us to be the first structurally balanced budget in 17 the last 10 years. So I want to thank them for all their hard work and contributions. Again, materials can be found at the presentation today. The materials can be found at azgovernor.gov/budget. If you have questions, you can send your questions to azbudget@az.gov. You email those and we'll respond to them. I want to thank you again. I appreciate it. This concludes our presentation.
Yeah.